Single dad opened his door for one night, not knowing she'd be his blind date the next day. Before we continue, please tell us where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Bennett Cole was making hot chocolate with his 6-year-old daughter Piper on a Tuesday night in late November. When the snowstorm that had been threatening all day finally hit Boulder, Colorado, like it had a personal vendetta against anyone who thought winter in the Rockies was pretty and romantic instead of absolutely brutal. They were standing in the kitchen watching the snow come down sideways outside the window, and Piper was asking if they could put extra marshmallows in the hot chocolate. Because Daddy, the storm is really, really big, so we need really, really big marshmallows to match. And Ben was laughing at her logic when the doorbell rang at exactly 8:15. And both of them froze because nobody rings doorbells during snowstorms this bad unless something is seriously wrong. Ben told Piper to stay in the kitchen and walk to the front door, trying to think of who would possibly be out in weather like this. Maybe a neighbor whose power went out, or someone whose car slid into a ditch. And when he opened the door, he found a woman standing on his porch absolutely covered in snow and shaking so hard her teeth were chattering loud enough to hear over the wind. "Please, I'm so sorry to bother you, but my car died about half a mile down the road, and my phone's completely dead, and I just need to call a tow truck. I promise I'm not a serial killer or anything. I'm just really cold and really stuck." And she said it all in one breath, like she was afraid he'd slam the door in her face before she could finish explaining. Ben's brain was doing that thing where it runs through every worst-case scenario because you're not supposed to just let random strangers into your house, especially when you've got a kid inside. But this woman was clearly in genuine distress. She was wearing scrubs like she worked at a hospital, and her lips were starting to turn blue. And he'd lived in Colorado long enough to know that hypothermia was not something you messed around with. "Come in, get out of the cold. We'll figure out the tow truck situation." And he stepped aside to let her in, and the relief on her face was so intense it made his chest hurt a little bit. She stumbled inside, and Ben closed the door against the wind, and the woman just stood there, dripping melting snow onto his entryway floor, and looking like she might actually cry from relief at being somewhere warm. "Thank you so much. I'm Tessa. I'm an ER nurse at Boulder General, and I just got off a 12-hour shift, and my stupid car has been making weird noises for a week, but I kept putting off taking it to the shop because I'm an idiot, and then it just died right in the middle of nowhere." And Tessa was still shaking while she talked, and Ben grabbed the throw blanket from the couch and handed it to her. "I'm Ben. That's Piper hiding around the corner, pretending she's not eavesdropping. Let me get you some dry clothes, and then you can use my phone." And sure enough, Piper poked her head around the kitchen doorway, looking curious and a little bit nervous about the stranger in their house. Tessa waved at Piper and said, "Hi, sweetie. I'm sorry for barging in like this. Your dad's being really nice helping me out." And Piper's eyes went huge. "Wait, you're a real nurse? Like you help people at the hospital?" Ben left them talking while he grabbed some of his own sweats and a hoodie for Tessa to change into, since she was soaked through. And when he came back, Piper was giving Tessa a complete rundown of every time she'd ever been to a doctor, and Tessa was listening like it was the most fascinating story she'd ever heard. Tessa changed in the bathroom and came out looking slightly less like a drowned cat, and Ben handed her his phone so she could call a tow company. And they both listened to the dispatcher say that there was no way anyone was coming out tonight. The roads were completely impassable, and they weren't sending trucks out until at least morning. Tessa's face fell, and she looked at Ben apologetically. "I'm so sorry, I don't want to impose, but I literally have nowhere else to go. All my friends live on the other side of the city, and the roads are apparently disaster zones." Ben made a decision that his sister would probably say was either really kind or really stupid, depending on how the night went. "You can stay here tonight, sleep on the couch. It's not safe for you to be out in that storm, and I'm not going to send someone back out into a blizzard when we've got a perfectly good couch." Tessa looked like she was going to argue, and then just nodded gratefully. "Thank you. Seriously, thank you. I'll be out of your hair first thing in the morning." Piper chose that exact moment to announce, "Daddy, we made hot chocolate, and there's enough for 3 people now." And she said it with such excitement that both adults had to smile, and somehow the 3 of them ended up sitting around the kitchen table, drinking hot chocolate with way too many marshmallows while the storm raged outside. They talked about everything and nothing. Tessa told stories about working in the ER that were funny instead of scary because Piper was listening, and Piper told Tessa about her school and her friends and how her dad was really good at making pancakes but really bad at doing hair braids. Around 9:30, Ben heated up leftover pasta, and they had this weird impromptu dinner together. And it should have felt awkward having a complete stranger eating spaghetti at his kitchen table, but somehow it just felt comfortable and easy. Piper kept asking Tessa questions about being a nurse until she was literally falling asleep in her chair, and Ben carried her up to bed while Tessa helped clean up the dinner dishes without being asked. When Ben came back downstairs, Tessa was standing by the living room window, watching the snow, and she turned around looking tired but peaceful. "Your daughter is incredible. You're doing an amazing job with her." And Ben felt that familiar ache in his chest. "Thanks. It's just been me and her for about 2.5 years now. My wife Laura passed away, and it's been a learning curve figuring out how to do this solo." Tessa's expression went soft with understanding. "I'm really sorry for your loss, and for what it's worth, you're clearly crushing it at the single dad thing. Piper's happy and smart and kind. That doesn't happen by accident." They talked for another hour about parenting and work and life. Nothing deep or romantic, just two people who'd been thrown together by circumstance finding out they had easy conversation. And around 11, Tessa was yawning so hard her jaw cracked, and Ben set her up on the couch with blankets and pillows. Morning came way too early, and Ben woke up to the sound of a truck outside, looked out the window and saw a tow truck pulling up, and when he went downstairs, Tessa was already awake and folding the blankets neatly on the couch. "Tow truck's here. I called them an hour ago. Didn't want to wake you guys up." And she was back in her now dry scrubs, looking professional and put together, and Ben walked her to the door feeling weirdly sad that this strange little interlude was ending. "Thank you for saving my life last night. Seriously, I could have frozen out there or worse. How can I ever repay you?" Tessa asked, and Ben shook his head. "Just pay it forward someday. Help someone else when they need it. That's all the payment I need." Piper came running down the stairs, still in her pajamas, to say goodbye. "Bye, Tessa. I hope your car gets fixed. You're the nicest nurse ever." And Tessa hugged her and told her to keep being awesome, and then she was gone, walking down the snowy driveway to the waiting tow truck. Ben spent the rest of the day trying not to think about the stranger who'd spent the night on his couch and how easy it had been to talk to her. And he was making lunch when his sister Monica called, and her voice was way too cheerful, which meant she was up to something. "Don't tell me you forgot. Bennett Cole, you promised me you'd go on this blind date. Tonight at 6 p.m. at Crossroads Cafe. Her name is Tessa, and that's literally all I'm telling you. Please tell me you're still going." And Ben's stomach dropped, because he had forgotten. He'd agreed to this stupid blind date 3 weeks ago just to get Monica off his back about getting back out there. Yeah, I remember 6 p.m., Crossroads, blind date with some woman named Tessa, and he said it with zero enthusiasm, and Monica made him promise twice more before she'd hang up. And Ben spent the afternoon dreading the awkward small talk and forced conversation that was definitely coming his way. 6 o'clock came too fast, and Ben found himself sitting at a corner table in Crossroads Cafe, feeling like an idiot in the button-down shirt Monica had insisted he wear. And he was checking his watch for the third time when the door opened and a woman walked in, shaking snow off her coat. Ben looked up out of habit, and his brain just completely stopped working because it was her, the nurse from last night, Tessa, standing in the doorway of the cafe, scanning the room, clearly looking for someone. Their eyes met at the exact same second, and both of them froze like someone had hit pause on the universe. And Tessa's mouth fell open, and she said loud enough for half the cafe to hear, "Ben!" And Ben stood up so fast he almost knocked over his chair. "You're my blind date?" Tessa walked over to the table, looking as shocked as Ben felt, and they just stared at each other for a solid 10 seconds before both of them started laughing. The kind of laughter that's equal parts disbelief and relief and complete absurdity. "This is the weirdest thing that has ever happened to me in my entire life," Tessa said while sitting down, and Ben nodded. "Same, like, what are the actual odds you knock on my door in a snowstorm and less than 24 hours later, we're set up on a blind date?" They sat there grinning at each other like idiots, and Tessa said, "Should we stay? Is this too weird?" Because we kind of already had dinner together last night, so this feels like backwards dating. And Ben surprised himself by saying, let's stay. I mean, we already know we can hold a conversation, and you've already seen my house and met my kid. We're way past the awkward first date stuff anyway. They ordered coffee and fell right back into the easy conversation from the night before. And Tessa admitted her friends had set up her dating profile without asking, and this was her first date in 2 years. And Ben confessed his sister had been harassing him for months to get back out there, and he'd only agreed to shut her up. So neither of us actually wanted to be here, Tessa said, and Ben laughed. Nope, I was planning to do the polite 1 hour coffee thing and then escape, but now I'm actually glad I came. And Tessa smiled. Yeah, me too. This is way better than I expected. Mostly because I already know you're a good person who helps strangers in snowstorms. That first blind date at Crossroads Cafe turned into a second date 3 days later, and then a third date the following week. And by the time they'd been seeing each other for 3 weeks, Ben realized he'd gone on more dates with Tessa than he'd gone on with anyone since Laura died. And the scary part was how easy it all felt. Like they just skipped over all the awkward getting to know you stuff and landed straight in the comfortable zone where you could be yourself without pretending. Tessa came over to Ben's house for movie night with Piper, and his daughter remembered her immediately from the snowstorm night, launched herself at Tessa screaming, "The nurse lady came back," and proceeded to talk Tessa's ear off about everything that had happened in the 3 weeks since they'd met. And Ben just stood there watching them interact and feeling his heart do something dangerous that felt a lot like falling. The fourth week hit, and everything went sideways at exactly the same time. Ben got the call from his primary investor on a Tuesday morning saying they were pulling their funding from his startup effective immediately, something about restructuring their portfolio and cutting losses on projects that weren't showing enough growth. And Ben spent 2 hours staring at spreadsheets, trying to find a way to keep the business alive before accepting that it was over. 3 years of 16-hour days and maxed out credit cards and telling himself it would pay off eventually, all gone in one phone call. And the office space lease that he'd signed 6 months ago was suddenly an anchor dragging him under because he couldn't afford it without the investor money. He had 60 days to either pay or vacate, and he didn't have the cash for either option. And the idea of admitting to everyone that he'd failed at the thing he'd poured everything into made him feel physically sick. Ben didn't tell Tessa, because what was he supposed to say? Hey, I know we've been dating for a month and things are going great, but my entire business just collapsed and I might lose my office space and I'm basically a failure? He started canceling their dates with vague excuses about being busy with work stuff, stopped responding to texts as quickly, and pulled back without meaning to because he was drowning in stress and shame and didn't want her to see him like this. Tessa noticed immediately because she wasn't an idiot, and she gave him space at first thinking, maybe he was dealing with something personal. Maybe the dating was moving too fast and he was freaking out. Maybe he wasn't as ready as he thought he was to move on from Laura, and she told herself to be patient and let him work through whatever was going on in his head. Week 5. Ben's late wife's parents drove up from Denver unannounced because apparently his sister Monica had mentioned in passing that Ben was seeing someone, and Margaret and Tom showed up at his door on a Saturday morning, looking concerned and slightly hurt. We heard you're dating someone. Why didn't you tell us? Margaret asked, and Ben invited them in, feeling guilty because he should have mentioned it. They were Piper's grandparents, and they deserved to know what was happening in her life. They were sitting in the living room when Piper came running down the stairs and grabbed Ben's phone off the coffee table to show her grandparents a photo, and the lock screen was a picture Ben had taken of Tessa and Piper baking cookies the week before, both of them covered in flour and laughing, and Margaret's face just crumpled. It's only been 2.5 years, Ben. You're already replacing her? Already bringing new women around our granddaughter like Laura never existed? And Margaret's voice was shaking, and Ben felt like he'd been punched in the stomach because he hadn't thought about it like that. Hadn't considered that moving on would feel like betrayal to the people who'd lost Laura too. Tom was quieter but clearly upset. We loved you like a son because of Laura, and now it feels like you're just erasing her and moving on like she didn't matter. And Ben tried to explain that it wasn't like that he'd always loved Laura, but he was allowed to find happiness again. but the words came out wrong and defensive, and they left an hour later with this horrible tension hanging between them. That same afternoon, Tessa decided she was done giving Ben space and drove to his house to ask him straight out what was going on. And when she got there, his car was in the driveway, but he didn't answer the door, so she walked around back and found him sitting on the porch steps, staring at a piece of paper that turned out to be an eviction notice from his office building. Ben, what's going on? Why didn't you tell me you were dealing with this? Tessa sat down next to him, and he looked at her with exhausted eyes. Because you deserve someone who has their life together, not someone whose business just crashed and burned. I didn't want you to think I was some kind of failure who can't even keep a startup running. Tessa took the eviction notice out of his hands and set it aside, and then turned to face him fully. Are you serious right now? I slept on your couch when my car died in a blizzard. You literally saw me at my lowest when I was dripping snow all over your floor and begging a stranger for help. You think I'd care if your business failed? Ben's voice came out rough. It's different. You were just having a bad night. I'm having a complete professional collapse. And my late wife's parents were here this morning telling me I'm replacing Laura too fast. And I don't know if they're right. Maybe I'm not ready for this. Maybe it's too soon. Tessa felt something crack in her chest, but she kept her voice steady. Are you ready? Not your in-laws, not your sister, not anyone else. Do you feel ready to be doing this with me? Ben looked at her, and all the walls he'd been building for the past 2 weeks just came down. I'm terrified, Tessa. I'm falling in love with you, and that scares me more than losing my business, because the last time I loved someone this much, I lost her, and it destroyed me. And Piper already loves you, and if this doesn't work out, she loses someone else important. Tessa's eyes filled with tears. I'm falling in love with you too. And yes, it's fast, and yes, it's scary, but Ben, I'm not going anywhere just because things got hard. That's literally the opposite of who I am. I work in an ER. Hard is my entire job description. They sat there on the porch steps and had the most honest conversation they'd had yet about fear and grief and taking risks when you're terrified of getting hurt again. And Ben admitted he'd been pushing her away because he thought she deserved better than his mess of a life. I don't want better. I want real, and this is real. You losing your startup doesn't change how I feel about you, Tessa said, and Ben took her hand. I need to talk to Laura's parents. I need to make them understand that loving you doesn't mean I loved her less. And I need to stop hiding when things go wrong, because that's not fair to you. That night, Ben called Margaret and Tom and had a long overdue conversation about grief and moving forward, told them that Laura would always be Piper's mom and he'd never try to replace her or erase her memory, but he was allowed to build new life and find love again. And it took an hour of talking and some tears on both sides, but they finally admitted they weren't really angry about him dating. They were scared of losing their connection to Piper as Ben built a new family. 2 days later, Ben officially closed his startup and started looking for regular tech jobs with steady paychecks, and it hurt like hell to admit defeat. But it also felt like this weight lifting off his shoulders, like he could finally breathe again without the constant stress of keeping a sinking ship afloat. Tessa was there when he locked up his office for the last time, helped him pack up 3 years' worth of work into boxes, and didn't say anything when he sat in his empty office and cried for 20 minutes about the dream he was letting go. You're not a failure for knowing when to pivot. You're smart for recognizing what's not working and being brave enough to try something different, she told him on the drive home. And Ben squeezed her hand and said, I love you. Like actually, genuinely love you. And I'm done pretending I'm not all in on this. Tessa pulled the car over into a parking lot and turned to face him. I love you too. And I love Piper. And I'm all in too. But Ben, we have to promise to be honest with each other going forward. No more hiding when things get hard. We deal with stuff together, or this doesn't work. Ben pulled her across the center console and kissed her. Deal. Complete honesty from here on out. We're a team now. And Tessa kissed him back, thinking about how weird it was that she'd knocked on a stranger's door in a snowstorm a month ago. And now that stranger was the person she wanted to build a life with. And maybe that's how the best things happened. Completely by accident when you least expected them. 6 months went by faster than Ben thought possible, and his life looked completely different from the chaos of that November when everything had fallen apart. He'd landed a solid software engineering job at a mid-sized tech company that paid well and had actual benefits in normal hours. And coming home at 5:30 every day instead of working until midnight felt like a luxury he'd forgotten existed. Tessa was still pulling her rotation of night shifts at Boulder General, but Ben had gotten into the habit of bringing her coffee at 2 in the morning when she was dragging, and the ER staff had adopted him as their unofficial mascot, who showed up with caffeine and sometimes donuts when things got really crazy. Piper had started calling Tessa by her first name, but treated her like family, would ask, "Is Tessa coming over tonight?" The same way other kids asked about their favorite aunts or cousins, and Ben's heart would do that melting thing every time he watched them together. Late November rolled around again, and Ben was watching the weather forecast predict another massive snowstorm heading for Boulder. And he looked at Tessa, who was curled up on his couch reading a book while Piper did homework at the kitchen table. And he realized with this overwhelming clarity that exactly 1 year ago, this woman had been a complete stranger, knocking on his door, desperate and freezing, and now she was the most important person in his life, besides his daughter. "Hey, Tessa, you know what tomorrow is?" Ben said, and Tessa looked up from her book with a confused expression. "Wednesday," and Ben laughed. "Yeah, but it's also November 23rd. 1 year exactly since you knocked on my door in that snowstorm and completely changed my life without either of us knowing it." Tessa's whole face softened, and she put down her book. "Oh my God, you're right. 1 year ago, I was standing on your porch thinking I might actually freeze to death, and you let a total stranger into your house. I can't believe it's been a whole year." They spent that evening reminiscing about that night, about how awkward it had been, and how neither of them could have predicted they'd end up here. And Piper was absolutely fascinated by the story she'd heard a million times, but never got tired of. Kept asking questions about what they were thinking and feeling during every part of the night. "Daddy, did you think Tessa was pretty when she was all wet and snowy?" And Ben laughed while Tessa's face went red. "I thought she looked like she needed help. That's what I was thinking about. But yeah, Bug, she was pretty even covered in snow." The next day, the predicted snowstorm hit right on schedule, and it was almost eerie how similar it was to the year before. The same sideways wind and heavy snow, and that specific quality of light that made everything look like a snow globe. Ben had taken the day off work, and Tessa had swapped shifts so she could be there. And the three of them were making hot chocolate together in the kitchen, just like that first night. And Ben kept catching Tessa's eye and smiling, because they were both thinking the same thing about how much had changed in 12 months. Around 8 o'clock that night, the exact time Tessa had shown up the year before, Ben told Piper he needed to talk to Tessa about something important, and could she go play in her room for a few minutes, and Piper got this knowing look on her face like she'd been expecting something, and ran upstairs way too eagerly. Ben led Tessa to the front door and opened it to show the storm raging outside exactly like it had been that night. And Tessa laughed and said, "Are you trying to recreate the moment? Because I'm significantly warmer and drier this time around, so it's not quite the same vibe." Ben took both her hands and his heart was pounding so hard he thought she might be able to hear it. "1 year ago, you knocked on that door freezing and desperate and scared, and I opened it not knowing that the person standing there would become the love of my life. And Tessa, I don't want to spend another year not being completely sure about our future together." He pulled a small box out of his pocket and got down on one knee right there in the doorway with the snow blowing in, and Tessa's hands flew to her mouth and tears immediately started running down her face. "Tessa Vaughn, you walked into my life during a snowstorm, and you never really left. You love my daughter like she's yours. You stuck around when my whole business collapsed. You're patient with me when I'm stuck in my head about grief and fear, and I want to spend the rest of my life opening doors for you both literally and metaphorically." Ben opened the box to show a simple diamond ring. Nothing crazy expensive because they were both still paying off student loans and living real life. But it was perfect, and it was real. "Will you marry me? Will you let me be the person you come home to after your night shifts? Will you build this crazy, beautiful life with me and Piper?" Tessa was full-on sobbing at this point and nodding so hard she looked like a bobblehead. "Yes, oh my God, yes, absolutely yes, I love you so much. This is the most perfect proposal in the history of proposals." Ben stood up and slid the ring on her finger, and kissed her while snow blew into his entryway, the same way it had a year ago. And from upstairs they heard Piper screaming, "She said yes! I heard her say yes! Can I come down now?" And both of them started laughing through their tears. Piper came running down the stairs and launched herself at both of them. "Does this mean Tessa's gonna be my actual mom now? Like for real official?" And Tessa knelt down to Piper's level. "I'm going to marry your dad, which means I'll be your stepmom, and I will love you and be here for you always. But your mom, Laura, will always be your mom too, and we're going to make sure you always remember her, okay?" Piper threw her arms around Tessa's neck. "I know, Dad shows me pictures and tells me stories, but I'm really, really happy you're going to be here too." They got married 6 months later in May, when the snow had finally melted and the mountains were green again. Small ceremony at a local venue with just family and close friends. And Piper was the flower girl wearing a purple dress she'd picked out herself and carrying a basket of petals like her life depended on getting it right. Ben's sister Monica gave a speech about how she took full credit for setting up the blind date, even though the snowstorm had technically introduced them first. And Tessa's co-workers gave a toast about how they never thought Tessa would settle down because she was married to her job. And Margaret and Tom were there in the front row crying happy tears because they'd come around to understanding that Ben loving Tessa didn't diminish what he'd had with Laura. Ben had set up a small memorial table with a photo of Laura and a candle, honoring the past while celebrating the future. And during the ceremony, he looked at it and felt a sense of peace, like maybe Laura was okay with all of this. Maybe she'd sent that snowstorm specifically to put Tessa on his doorstep. The reception was at their house, the same house where everything had started, and there were photos everywhere of their journey from that weird first night to now. And on the mantle was a new family photo of the three of them, next to a smaller frame holding Laura's picture, because they were teaching Piper that families can grow and change, and hold space for everyone who matters. During their first dance, Tessa whispered, "A year and a half ago, I knocked on a stranger's door, thinking I just needed a phone and a warm place to wait. I had no idea I was knocking on the door to my entire future." And Ben whispered back, "And I opened it thinking I was just helping someone for one night. Didn't know I was letting in the person who'd make me believe in second chances." They danced while Piper ran around with the other kids and the sun set over the mountains. And everything felt exactly right in the way that real life rarely does, but sometimes, if you're really lucky, manages to be. 2 years after the proposal, on another snowy November evening, Ben and Tessa were home with Piper, who was now 9, and their 10-month-old son Aaron, who Tessa had given birth to the previous winter. And the doorbell rang during dinner, which was weird because they weren't expecting anyone. Piper jumped up yelling, "Maybe it's someone who needs help like Mom did." And she'd started calling Tessa Mom about 6 months after the wedding. And Ben and Tessa exchanged a look because they'd been teaching Piper about kindness and helping others and using their story as an example. Ben opened the door, but it was just a delivery guy dropping off a package. No one in distress, no life-changing moment, but Piper looked up at him very seriously and said, "Daddy, you always have to check though, right? Because you never know who's going to be standing there when you open the door. Sometimes the best things in life happen when you least expect them." Ben opened his door for a stranger on a snowy night and found his future standing there shivering and desperate. Tessa knocked on a random door thinking she just needed temporary shelter and found a permanent home. They went on a blind date the next day, not knowing they'd already started falling in love the night before. If this story reminded you that kindness to strangers can change everything, that the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes, and that opening your door both literally and emotionally can let in exactly what you didn't know you needed, hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who needs to hear that second chances are real, and sometimes they show up in a snowstorm. Thanks for being here with us, and remember, you never know what life has waiting on the other side of the door until you're brave enough to open it.